The first thing Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez noticed wasn't her size, though at 5'4", she looked like a sparrow among hawks in the pre-dawn darkness of Camp Pendleton. It wasn't her age, though at 22, she seemed impossibly young compared to the weathered faces surrounding her. It was the way she stood perfectly still while every other recruit shifted nervously in the California desert air, their boots scuffing against the gravel as they waited for Hell Week to begin. Rodriguez had been a Marine Corps drill instructor for 8 years, had broken down and rebuilt hundreds of recruits, had seen cocky football players crumble on day 2 and witnessed quiet farm boys emerge as natural leaders. But something about Cadet Elena Vasquez made him roll his eyes before she'd even opened her mouth. Maybe it was the pristine condition of her gear, arranged with mathematical precision. Maybe it was the way she'd answered, "Yes, sir," during roll call with a voice that carried no trace of the fear that should have been gnawing at her gut. Or maybe it was simply because she was the only woman in a group of 37 recruits, and Rodriguez had seen this movie before. Ambitious young women who thought they could prove a point, only to wash out when the reality of Special Forces training crushed their idealistic dreams. The morning air was thick with tension and the acrid smell of diesel fuel from the transport trucks that had delivered them to this god-forsaken corner of the Mojave Desert. Hell Week wasn't technically part of basic training. It was an experimental program designed to identify candidates for the most elite units, a crucible that would test not just physical endurance but mental resilience, tactical thinking, and the kind of unbreakable spirit that couldn't be taught in any classroom. "Listen up, maggots." Rodriguez's voice cut through the darkness like a rusty blade. His weathered face, scarred by 3 tours in Afghanistan, remained impassive as he surveyed the group. "You've volunteered for something that 97% of Marines will never experience. Over the next 7 days, you will discover who you really are when everything is stripped away. Your comfort, your sleep, your certainty, your excuses." His eyes swept across the group and lingered for just a moment on Elena. "Some of you think you know what hell looks like. You don't." Elena stood at attention, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin around her temples. Her brown eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but Rodriguez could see her taking in every detail of their surroundings with peripheral vision, the way a good soldier should. The training facility sprawled across 40 acres of unforgiving terrain, dotted with obstacle courses that looked like medieval torture devices and concrete structures designed to break spirits as much as bodies. To her left stood Private Jackson Cole, a former college wrestler from Ohio whose thick neck and cauliflower ears told the story of 1,000 brutal matches. To her right, Private Tommy Nyam, barely 18, but already carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd grown up hard in the streets of Los Angeles. Behind her, she could hear the nervous breathing of Private Michael Santos, a former seminary student who'd traded his Bible for a rifle after losing his younger brother in a drive-by shooting. Rodriguez began his circuit around the group, his combat boots creating a rhythmic percussion against the gravel. "Hell Week begins at 0500 hours, he announced, checking his watch. "It is currently 0457. In 3 minutes your old lives end. You will not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch. You will not eat unless you earn it. You will not quit unless you want to live with that shame for the rest of your pathetic lives." The other training officers emerged from the shadows like predators sensing wounded prey. Staff Sergeant Lisa Chen, a former Army Ranger whose cold blue eyes had seen things in Syria that she'd never talk about. Gunnery Sergeant Robert Bull Williams, 6'6" and built like a mountain, whose presence alone had made grown men reconsider their life choices. Master Sergeant Patricia Viper Morrison, whose deceptively soft voice concealed a tactical mind that had orchestrated successful missions in 3 different conflict zones. "Your first challenge," Rodriguez continued, "is a 12-mile ruck march through terrain that would make a mountain goat think twice. You'll be carrying full packs, 60 pounds minimum, plus your weapon and water. Anyone who falls more than 50 meters behind the group is automatically disqualified. Anyone who drops their pack gets to start over from the beginning." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "With a heavier pack." Elena adjusted her shoulder straps with movements so subtle they were almost imperceptible. Rodriguez noticed anyway. He noticed everything. The way she'd positioned her water bottles for optimal weight distribution. The extra padding she'd added to her shoulder straps, not for comfort, but to prevent the kind of chafing that could become debilitating over long distances. The way she'd tied her bootlaces with a knot he recognized from maritime operations, designed to stay tight under extreme conditions. "Where'd you learn to prep gear like that, Cadet Vasquez?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying across the formation. "My grandfather, sir," Elena replied without hesitation. "Gunnery Sergeant Eduardo Vasquez, served in Vietnam and Grenada." Rodriguez felt a flicker of something. Not quite respect, but a grudging acknowledgement that she'd done her homework. Military families often produced military children, but that could cut both ways. Sometimes it created soldiers who understood sacrifice and duty. Other times it created kids trying to live up to legends they could never match. "Does your grandfather teach you anything else?" Rodriguez pressed. "Yes, sir. He taught me that the only easy day was yesterday." A few of the recruits chuckled nervously. Rodriguez didn't. That was a Navy SEAL motto, and either Elena was showing off, or she'd grown up understanding that elite military units shared certain core principles regardless of branch affiliation. "We'll see," Rodriguez muttered, but something in Elena's bearing made him take a second look. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't puffing out her chest or projecting false bravado like half the men around her. She was simply ready. The sound of diesel engines roaring to life echoed across the facility as support vehicles took their positions along the route they'd be marching. Medical trucks, water resupply vehicles, and one particularly ominous black SUV that everyone knew was for collecting those who couldn't continue. 0500 hours, Rodriguez announced. Hell Week begins now. The march started at a deceptively easy pace, boots crunching rhythmically against the desert floor, as 37 recruits began what would either be the most transformative week of their lives or their introduction to the bitter taste of failure. Elena fell into position near the middle of the group, her breathing steady and controlled as the pack settled against her shoulders with the familiar weight of preparation meeting reality. By mile 3, the first recruit was already falling behind. Private Anderson, a former high school football star from Texas, had talked constantly during the transport to the facility about his bench press numbers and his 40-yard dash time. Now he was learning the hard truth that functional strength and athletic ability were very different things. His pack bounced with each step, a clear sign that he'd never learned proper load management, and sweat was already streaming down his face despite the cool morning air. Elena maintained her position, her stride never varying, her breathing never changing. Rodriguez, monitoring the march from a military vehicle that paralleled their route, found himself checking on her progress more frequently than he cared to admit. There was something unsettling about her consistency, not just physical, but mental. While other recruits were already showing signs of the internal dialogue that preceded breaking points, Elena seemed to exist in a bubble of calm focus. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Mile 6 brought the first major test. The route led them up a series of switchbacks that gained 800 feet of elevation over the course of 2 miles. The pack straps that had felt manageable at ground level now felt like they were cutting into shoulders and redistributing weight in ways that human anatomy wasn't designed to handle. This was where Hell Week separated those who'd prepared from those who'd simply shown up. Private Cole, the wrestler, was maintaining his position, but Rodriguez could see the telltale signs of someone fighting their own body. His jaw was clenched tight, his shoulders were riding higher than they should, and his stride was shortening with each step. He'd make it through this march, but he was already spending reserves he'd need later. Private Nguyen was struggling more than his pride wanted to admit. Growing up on the streets had given him mental toughness, but it hadn't prepared his body for sustained physical punishment. He was breathing hard, his pack was shifting with each step, and Rodriguez could see him calculating whether he could make it to the next checkpoint. And then there was Elena, moving up the switchbacks like she was built for this specific type of punishment. Her breathing remained controlled, her pack never shifted, and her stride never changed. More unsettling, she was using the terrain to her advantage in ways that showed she understood efficiency of movement. When the trail offered a slightly firmer surface, she adjusted her line by inches to take advantage of it. When they hit loose gravel, she shortened her stride just enough to maintain traction without wasting energy. By mile 8, 3 recruits had been loaded into the black SUV. Anderson had finally admitted defeat when his pack straps had rubbed his shoulders raw, and his legs had started shaking uncontrollably. Two others had simply stopped walking and stood by the side of the trail staring at nothing, their minds having reached the conclusion that this wasn't worth the pain. "Vasquez," Rodriguez called from his vehicle, "take point." It was a test, and Elena knew it. Taking the lead meant setting the pace for the entire group, becoming responsible for everyone's success or failure. It meant being visible, being accountable, and becoming a target for anyone looking for someone to blame when things went wrong. Elena moved to the front of the formation without hesitation, and within 50 meters, Rodriguez realized he'd made a mistake. Her pace was exactly what it had been when she was in the middle of the group, but now everyone else had to match it. She wasn't trying to prove anything or make anyone else suffer. She was simply maintaining the standard she'd set for herself. But that standard was apparently higher than what most of the group could sustain. Private Santos, the former seminary student, was the next to break. His faith had carried him through the death of his brother and through basic training, but his body had reached its limit. Rodriguez watched through binoculars as Santos stumbled, caught himself, stumbled again, and then sat down heavily on a boulder beside the trail. He was done, and he knew it. But something unexpected happened. Elena, still leading the group, turned around and started walking back towards Santos. Rodriguez grabbed his radio. "Cadet Vasquez, maintain your position and continue the march." Elena's response came through the radio with perfect clarity. "Sir, request permission to assist fellow cadet." "Denied. Continue the march." What happened next would stick with Rodriguez for years. Elena looked at Santos, then at the radio in her hand, then back at Santos. For just a moment, her perfect composure cracked, and Rodriguez could see the human being beneath the soldier. She was calculating, weighing her own success against someone else's welfare, and the struggle was visible in her eyes. Then she made her choice. Elena walked back to Santos, knelt beside him, and said something Rodriguez couldn't hear. Santos shook his head, clearly telling her to leave him behind. Elena responded by taking off her own pack, rearranging the contents, and redistributing some of Santos's gear into her own load. She helped him to his feet, handed him back his lightened pack, and gestured for him to fall in behind her. Rodriguez keyed his radio again. "Cadet Vasquez, you are in direct violation of orders." Elena's voice came back steady and clear. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." "You are risking your own position in this program." "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." "Continue the march." Rodriguez sat back in his vehicle, staring at Elena through his binoculars as she resumed leading the group. She'd just violated a direct order to help someone who would probably wash out anyway. She'd demonstrated that her loyalty to her fellow soldiers outweighed her loyalty to the chain of command. In a real military unit, that kind of insubordination could result in court-martial. In Hell Week, it was either the sign of a natural leader or someone who didn't understand what was at stake. The march continued through increasingly difficult terrain, and Elena maintained her impossible consistency. Mile 10 took them through a section of loose sand that felt like walking through quicksand. Mile 11 included a water crossing that soaked everyone from the waist down and added the psychological challenge of dealing with wet boots and chafing. Mile 12 was a final sprint across flat ground that should have been easy, but felt impossible on legs that had been pushed beyond their normal limits. When they finally reached the finish line, 29 recruits remained. Elena crossed first, not because she'd been trying to race anyone, but because she'd never slowed down. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, her face was streaked with dust, but her breathing was controlled, and her posture was upright. She looked like she could do another 12 miles if necessary. Santos crossed the line 30 seconds behind her, tears streaming down his face. Rodriguez realized that Elena's intervention had probably saved the young man's military career. Without her help, he would have been loaded into the black SUV at mile 8. With it, he'd proven to himself that he could endure more than he'd thought possible. Rodriguez called for a formation, and the remaining recruits lined up with the mechanical precision of people who were too tired to think, but too disciplined to quit. He walked the line, studying each face, cataloging who was already mentally preparing for the next challenge and who was just trying to survive the current moment. When he reached Elena, he stopped. She was standing at attention, her eyes focused on some point beyond his shoulder, waiting for whatever came next. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no pride at having finished first, no exhaustion despite what she'd just accomplished. She looked like a soldier waiting for orders. "Cadet Vasquez," Rodriguez said quietly, so only she could hear. "Yes, sir." That was day one. For the first time since Hell Week had begun, Elena's composure flickered. Just for a moment, Rodriguez saw something in her eyes that might have been surprise, or calculation, or possibly the first hint of doubt. Then it was gone, replaced by the same steady focus she'd maintained throughout the march. "Yes, sir," she replied. "Understood, sir." Rodriguez moved on, but he was beginning to realize that his initial assessment of Elena Vasquez might have been wrong. She wasn't trying to prove a point or live up to some family legacy. She wasn't attempting to be the first woman to complete Hell Week or breaking barriers for the sake of breaking them. She was simply doing what needed to be done, one step at a time, with a consistency that was starting to look less like stubbornness and more like something he'd seen in only a handful of soldiers during his entire career. As the recruits were dismissed to their first meal in 18 hours, Rodriguez found himself wondering what Elena's grandfather had really taught her. Because whatever lessons Eduardo Vasquez had passed down to his granddaughter, they were about to be tested in ways that would reveal whether Elena was truly ready for what the next 6 days would demand. The sun was climbing higher in the desert sky, and Hell Week was just beginning. The mess hall at Camp Pendleton buzzed with the low conversation of exhausted recruits trying to process what they'd just experienced. Elena sat at a table near the corner, methodically eating her way through a tray of scrambled eggs, toast, and what the military optimistically called fruit salad. Her movements were economical, purposeful, fuel for the machine rather than pleasure eating. Around her, other recruits were already bonding over their shared ordeal, forming the kinds of connections that either held units together or fell apart under pressure. "Jesus, Vasquez," Private Cole said, dropping into the seat across from her. His thick, restless frame seemed to fill the entire chair, and his voice carried the hoarse edge of someone who'd pushed their body beyond its comfort zone. "Where the hell did you learn to move like that?" Elena looked up from her tray, her dark eyes taking in Cole's flushed face and the way he was favoring his left shoulder. "Practice," she said simply, then returned to her eggs. Private Nguyen joined them, moving with the careful precision of someone whose legs were still questioning whether they wanted to support his weight. "Practice, my ass," he said, settling onto the bench with a barely suppressed groan. "I've been running since I was 12. Trying to stay ahead of gang colors and cops who didn't care about the difference. Never seen anyone move like you just did." Elena paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. It was the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton that anyone had pushed past her standard responses, and she could feel the attention of several nearby tables shifting in their direction. The truth was complicated, layered with memories she'd spent years learning to compartmentalize, and she wasn't sure how much she wanted to share with people she'd known for less than 24 hours. "My grandfather didn't just serve," she said finally. "He came home broken. PTSD, they called it later, but back then it was just something wrong that nobody talked about. He'd wake up screaming, or sometimes he'd disappear for days without explanation." She took a bite of toast, chewing slowly while she decided how much to reveal. "When I was 8, he started taking me hiking. Said if I was going to be a Vasquez, I needed to understand what it meant to never quit." Santos appeared at their table, moving slowly, but under his own power. His face was pale, but his eyes held a gratitude that made Elena uncomfortable. She'd done what needed to be done, nothing more, but Santos was looking at her like she'd saved his life rather than simply redistributed some weight in his pack. "Thank you," Santos said quietly, settling onto the bench beside Nguyen. "On the trail, when you came back." "Don't," Elena interrupted. "You would have made it anyway. You just needed to remember that your body can go further than your mind thinks it can." Cole laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My mind is telling me that I'm about to spend the next 6 days discovering exactly how much punishment I can take before something important breaks." Elena studied Cole's face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way he was holding his shoulders. Wrestling had given him explosive strength and the ability to function through pain, but endurance events required a different kind of mental discipline. She'd seen it before. Athletes who dominated in their sport but struggled when the rules changed, and there was no referee to stop the fight. "What are you thinking about right now?" Elena asked. Cole looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Right now, this moment. What's going through your head?" "I'm thinking about how much my feet hurt. how sore I'm going to be tomorrow, and whether I'm tough enough to handle whatever Rodriguez has planned for us next. Elena nodded. That's the problem. What's the problem? You're thinking about tomorrow and yesterday. Pain is just information. Your body telling you about current conditions, but you're adding stories to it, projecting into the future, carrying weight that doesn't exist yet. Elena finished her eggs and moved on to the fruit salad, which tasted like it had been engineered in a laboratory to provide maximum nutrition with minimum flavor. My grandfather used to say that suffering was pain plus story. If you can separate them, you can function through almost anything. Private Williams, who'd been listening from the next table, turned around in his chair. Sounds like Buddhist philosophy. Sounds like survival, Elena replied. Buddhism, Stoicism, military psychology, they all end up in the same place when you strip away the academic language. Present moment awareness. Acceptance of what is rather than resistance to what might be. Nguyen shook his head. That's easier said than done when some drill instructor is screaming in your face and your body feels like it's falling apart. Elena considered this while she chewed a piece of cantaloupe that had the texture of rubber and the flavor of disappointment. How did you explain to someone that the screaming drill instructor was just noise, that physical discomfort was just sensation, that the stories their minds were telling them about failure and inadequacy were just stories? When I was 15, Elena said slowly, my grandfather took me on a 3-day hike through the mountains outside Taos. Second day, I stepped wrong and twisted my ankle. Not broken, but painful enough that every step was like getting stabbed. I wanted to quit, wanted him to call for help, wanted to make the pain stop. She paused, remembering the weight of her pack digging into her shoulders, the way the trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them, the moment when she'd realized that her grandfather wasn't going to rescue her from the situation. He told me I had two choices. I could focus on the pain and turn every step into a negotiation with myself about whether I could take one more. Or I could accept that the ankle was injured, adjust my hiking technique to accommodate that reality, and focus on the rhythm of walking instead of the sensation of pain. Which did you choose? Santos asked. Both, Elena admitted. Spent the first hour feeling sorry for myself and trying to bargain with the universe. Spent the second hour being angry at my grandfather for not fixing the problem. Third hour, I finally started listening to what he was trying to teach me. Cole leaned forward. Which was? That the pain wasn't the problem. My relationship with the pain was the problem. Once I stopped fighting it, stopped trying to make it go away, stopped telling myself stories about how unfair it was, once I just accepted it as part of the current reality and adjusted accordingly, I could function. Elena finished her fruit salad and pushed the tray away, walked the last 15 miles on a sprained ankle and never asked him to slow down. The table fell quiet, each recruit processing this information through the filter of their own experience. Elena could see them trying to apply her grandfather's philosophy to their current situation, looking for some mental trick that would make Hell Week easier to endure. It's not a technique, Elena said, reading their expressions. It's a fundamental shift in how you relate to difficulty. Most people spend more energy resisting challenges than they do meeting them. They exhaust themselves fighting against reality instead of adapting to it. Rodriguez's voice cut across the mess hall like a blade through silk. Finish eating, ladies. You've got 10 minutes before the next evolution. Elena stood immediately, her body responding to the command before her conscious mind had fully processed the words. Around her, other recruits were still negotiating with the idea of leaving their food behind, calculating whether they had time for a few more bites or wondering what evolution meant in the context of Hell Week. As she walked toward the exit, Elena caught sight of Rodriguez watching her from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but she could feel the weight of his attention, the way a predator's gaze might feel to its intended prey. He was studying her, cataloging her responses, looking for weaknesses or strengths that he could exploit during the challenges ahead. Outside the mess hall, the California sun was climbing toward its zenith, and the temperature was already beginning to hint at the brutal heat that would define the afternoon hours. The recruits formed up in the same formation they'd used for the morning march, but Elena could see the difference in their posture, their energy, their collective confidence. The successful completion of the 12-mile ruck had given them their first taste of achievement, but it had also revealed the scope of what they were attempting to survive. Staff Sergeant Chen appeared beside Rodriguez, her cold blue eyes scanning the formation like a digital camera, cataloging potential points of failure. Next evolution is obstacle course, she announced. 30 stations designed to test functional strength, problem-solving ability, and mental resilience under physical duress. Elena had studied the obstacle courses used by various special forces units, had spent countless hours in civilian gyms and training facilities preparing for challenges she could only imagine. But as they marched toward the training area, she could see that Hell Week's obstacles were designed not just to test physical capabilities, but to identify psychological breaking points. The first station was deceptively simple, a series of monkey bars spanning 50 feet across a sand pit. Easy enough for anyone with basic upper body strength, except that each bar was slightly different. Some thicker, some thinner, some covered with a substance that made gripping difficult, some positioned at angles that forced awkward hand transitions. Elena watched the first few recruits attempt the crossing. Private Anderson, who'd been collected by the black SUV during the morning march, was no longer with them, a reminder that Hell Week offered no second chances and no participation trophies. Private Johnson, a former gymnast, made the crossing look effortless, his experience with apparatus work translating directly to this challenge. Private Martinez struggled, but completed it through sheer determination and grip strength developed during years of construction work. When Elena's turn came, she approached the monkey bars with the same methodical focus she'd applied to the morning march. She studied the pattern of different bar types, identifying the sequence that would allow for the most efficient hand transitions. She tested her grip on the first bar, adjusting her hand position to accommodate the coating that made it slippery. Then she crossed, hand over hand, with a rhythm that never varied and a focus that never wavered. No wasted motion, no unnecessary speed, no showboating, just efficient movement from point A to point B. When she dropped into the sand pit on the far side, she wasn't breathing hard, wasn't shaking from the effort, wasn't celebrating the completion of the challenge. Rodriguez, watching from the sidelines, made a note on his clipboard. Station 2 was a wall climb, 15 feet of vertical surface with minimal handholds and a rope that might or might not support a person's full weight. Station 3 was a crawl through a tunnel system that tested claustrophobia tolerance and navigation skills in confined spaces. Station 4 was a tire drag that required moving a 200-pound truck tire across 50 yards of uneven terrain using only upper body strength. By Station 10, 8 more recruits had been eliminated. Some had failed specific obstacles and been unable to complete them within the time limit. Others had completed the physical requirements but had broken down mentally, overwhelmed by the cumulative stress of continuous challenges without rest or recovery time. Elena moved through each station with the same consistent focus, never fast enough to show off, never slow enough to struggle, never displaying emotion regardless of whether the challenge was something she'd trained for or something completely unfamiliar. At Station 15, a rope climb followed immediately by a 100-yard sprint. She completed the evolution and immediately moved to the recovery position, controlling her breathing and heart rate while she waited for the rest of the group to finish. Vasquez. Rodriguez called. Front and center. Elena jogged to where Rodriguez was standing, came to attention and waited for instructions. Around them, recruits were scattered across various obstacles, some succeeding, some failing, all learning things about themselves they might have preferred not to know. "What's your background?" Rodriguez asked. "Sir, could you be more specific?" "Athletic background, training, whatever prepared you for this." Elena considered the question. The complete answer was complicated, involving years of training that had started as a way to connect with her grandfather's legacy and had evolved into something much more personal. But Rodriguez wasn't asking for her life story. "Cross-country running in high school," she said. "Rock climbing and mountaineering in college. Martial arts training since I was 12. Rodriguez studied her face, looking for signs of deception or omission. "That's it?" "And military history, sir. Studied tactics, strategy, unit cohesion, leadership under pressure." "Academic study or practical application?" Elena hesitated for just a moment. "Both, sir." Rodriguez made another note on his clipboard, but Elena could see that her answer had raised more questions than it had answered. The truth was that she'd spent the last 4 years preparing specifically for this moment, training not just her body, but her mind for the kind of sustained pressure that Hell Week represented. But explaining that would require revealing motivations she wasn't sure she understood herself. "You're dismissed," Rodriguez said. "Join the formation." As Elena rejoined the group, she noticed Santos struggling with Station 18, a series of lateral movements that required coordinating upper and lower body strength while maintaining balance on an unstable surface. His legs were shaking from fatigue, his breathing was labored, and his face showed the kind of desperation that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. Elena watched from the formation, fighting the urge to offer encouragement or advice. Rodriguez was watching too, studying Santos's struggle with the clinical interest of someone cataloging human limitations under stress. This was part of Hell Week's design. Not just individual challenges, but the psychological pressure of knowing that everyone was watching, everyone was judging, everyone was measuring your performance against their own. Santos fell twice, got up twice, approached the obstacle for a third attempt. Elena could see him calculating, weighing the cost of another failure against the possibility that his body simply couldn't meet the challenge. This was the moment where many recruits made the decision to quit, not because they were physically incapable, but because the accumulated weight of doubt, fatigue, and public failure became too much to carry. But Santos didn't quit. He approached the obstacle for the third time, moved through it with careful precision rather than explosive speed, and completed the challenge. When he rejoined the formation, his face showed a mixture of relief and determination that Elena recognized from her own experience with seemingly impossible challenges. By the time all 30 stations had been completed, 21 recruits remained. Elena had finished each challenge, never first, never last, never struggling, never celebrating. Rodriguez had filled several pages of notes, most of them focused on her consistent performance and the way other recruits were beginning to use her as a benchmark for their own efforts. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of amber and crimson, Rodriguez called for formation one final time. "Day 1 is complete," he announced. "Tomorrow begins at 0400 hours. You have 6 hours to eat, shower, and sleep. I suggest you use them wisely." Elena fell out with the rest of the group, but as she walked toward the barracks, she could feel Rodriguez's eyes on her back. She'd completed day 1 of Hell Week without breaking a sweat, without showing strain, without revealing anything about her true capabilities or limitations. But she knew that Rodriguez was beginning to understand that there was more to her story than she'd shared. The real question was whether she was ready for him to discover what that story actually contained. The alarm pierced the darkness at 0400 hours, but Elena had been awake for 10 minutes, lying motionless in her narrow bunk while she listened to the breathing patterns of the other recruits around her. Some were sleeping deeply, their bodies desperately trying to recover from the previous day's punishment. Others were restless, shifting positions frequently as their minds churned through anxiety about what the coming day might bring. A few, like Private Cole in the bunk across from her, weren't sleeping at all. She could hear the controlled breathing of someone pretending to rest while their thoughts raced. Elena rose silently, her movements economical and precise in the pre-dawn darkness. Her gear was laid out exactly as she'd arranged it before sleeping. Uniform pressed, boots clean, equipment positioned for optimal efficiency. Around her, other recruits were beginning to stir. Some with the mechanical precision of military discipline, others with the confused disorientation of people who'd forgotten where they were and why they were there. The barracks came alive with the sounds of preparation. Zippers closing, boots hitting the floor, low conversations as people tried to shake off the fog of insufficient sleep. Elena dressed quickly, checked her appearance in the small mirror mounted beside her bunk, and was ready to go before most of the others had even gotten out of bed. "Damn, Vasquez," muttered Private Williams, struggling to find his uniform in the darkness. "You got a timer in your head or something?" Elena didn't respond, but the question hit closer to home than Williams realized. She did have an internal timer, developed through years of training that had conditioned her body to wake naturally at specific intervals. More than that, she had the ability to function at high levels regardless of sleep deprivation, a skill that her grandfather had considered essential for any soldier who might find themselves in extended combat situations. By 0430, the remaining 21 recruits were formed up outside the barracks, standing at attention in the cool desert air while they waited for Rodriguez and his training staff to appear. Elena stood in the second rank, her posture perfect, her breathing controlled, her mind already shifting into the focused state that would carry her through whatever challenges the day might bring. Rodriguez emerged from the darkness like a specter, his combat boots creating the same rhythmic percussion against the gravel that had marked their introduction to Hell Week. Behind him came the other training officers, each carrying equipment that suggested the day's activities would be significantly more complex than the previous day's march and obstacle course. Yesterday was orientation, Rodriguez announced, his voice cutting through the morning air with surgical precision. Today you discover what happens when everything you think you know about yourself turns out to be wrong. Staff Sergeant Chen stepped forward carrying a large waterproof bag that contained what appeared to be communication equipment. First evolution is a navigation exercise, she said. You'll be divided into teams of 3, given coordinates for 6 checkpoints scattered across 40 square miles of desert terrain and expected to reach each location within specific time windows. Elena felt a subtle shift in the energy of the formation. Individual challenges tested personal limits, but team exercises introduced variables that no amount of personal preparation could control. Success or failure would depend not just on her own capabilities, but on the strengths and weaknesses of whoever ended up on her team. Teams will be assigned randomly, Rodriguez continued, consulting his clipboard. Team Alpha, Vasquez, Santos and Nguyen. Elena processed this information quickly. Santos had shown heart during the previous day's march, but his physical capabilities were clearly limited. Nguyen was mentally tough and had good endurance, but his urban background meant he probably had minimal experience with wilderness navigation. She would essentially be carrying the team, which was fine. She'd expected as much. Each team gets 1 map, 1 compass, 1 radio, and 1 GPS unit. Chen continued. However, the GPS units have been programmed to fail at random intervals. The radios work on a limited frequency range and may not function in all terrain. Your map is accurate, but it's from 1987, so some landmarks may have changed. Rodriguez smiled, and Elena recognized the expression of someone about to reveal information that would make an already difficult challenge significantly worse. Oh, and one more thing. At each checkpoint, you'll find instructions for a team challenge that must be completed before you can continue. These challenges are designed to test leadership, problem-solving, and your ability to function as a unit under pressure. The teams were given 15 minutes to study their maps, plan their routes, and distribute equipment. Elena spread the map on the ground and immediately began analyzing the terrain features, identifying potential water sources, calculating distances between checkpoints, and noting areas where navigation might become challenging due to similar topographical features. Okay, Santos said, kneeling beside her. You obviously know what you're doing. Just tell us where to go and we'll follow. Elena looked up from the map, studying Santos's face in the growing daylight. His willingness to defer to her leadership was practical, but it also revealed something about his own confidence that concerned her. Hell Week was designed to identify leaders, not followers, and Santos would eventually need to demonstrate his own decision-making capabilities. We're a team, Elena said, which means we all contribute to planning and execution. She pointed to the first checkpoint, located on a ridge approximately 8 miles to the northeast. What do you see when you look at this route? Santos studied the map, tracing the contour lines with his finger. Looks like we'll be climbing for most of the first leg. Maybe 200 feet of elevation gain over about 3 miles. Good. Nguyen, what concerns you about that approach? Nguyen leaned over the map, his street-smart eyes taking in details that related to his urban survival experience. If we're climbing, we'll be visible from a long distance, and if the weather changes, we'll be exposed on high ground with nowhere to take cover. Elena nodded. Both observations were correct, and both showed that her teammates were capable of tactical thinking despite their different backgrounds. Santos, you're right about the elevation gain. That's going to slow us down, especially in the heat of the day. Nguyen, exposure is definitely a concern, but look at the alternative routes. She traced several possible paths on the map, each with different advantages and disadvantages. The direct route was physically demanding but straightforward. A longer route through lower terrain would be easier to navigate but would add significant distance. A third option followed a series of washes and arroyos that would provide cover but might become impassable if weather conditions changed. I vote for the direct route, Santos said. Get the hard climbing done early while we're fresh. I vote for the wash route, Nguyen countered. Better concealment, and we can move faster on the flat ground. Both men looked at Elena, waiting for her to cast the deciding vote. Instead, she folded the map and stood up. We're taking the direct route, but for reasons neither of you mentioned. Which are? Santos asked. The direct route tests our physical capabilities early in the exercise. If any of us are going to have problems with the demands of the day, better to discover that now rather than 10 miles into a longer route. Elena shouldered her pack and checked her compass bearing. Plus, the high ground gives us visual reference points for navigation to the remaining checkpoints. Rodriguez's whistle cut through the morning air, signaling the start of the exercise. Elena's team began moving immediately, falling into a formation that put her in the lead position with Santos and Nguyen following at 5-meter intervals. The early morning air was still cool, but Elena could already feel the promise of brutal heat radiating from the desert floor. The first mile was deceptively easy, following a well-defined trail through relatively flat terrain dotted with Joshua trees and sagebrush. Elena maintained a steady pace that was fast enough to keep them on schedule, but conservative enough to preserve energy for the more demanding terrain ahead. Behind her, she could hear Santos and Nguyen settling into the rhythm of movement, their breathing still controlled, their footsteps confident. By mile 2, the trail began to climb more steeply, and Elena could hear the subtle changes in her teammates, breathing that indicated they were beginning to work harder. The terrain was becoming more technical, requiring careful foot placement and occasional use of hands for balance on loose rock sections. "How you doing back there?" Elena called without turning around. "Good," Santos replied, but his voice carried a slight breathlessness that suggested he was already pushing harder than he wanted to admit. "Solid," Nguyen added, and Elena could hear that he was managing the physical demands better than Santos, but was probably unfamiliar with this type of terrain. Mile 3 brought them to a section of switchbacks. They gained 400 feet of elevation over the course of half a mile. The trail surface was loose shale that shifted underfoot, making each step a small negotiation between forward progress and maintaining balance. Elena adjusted her pace slightly, giving her teammates more time to navigate the technical sections while still maintaining their overall schedule. At the top of the switchbacks, they reached their first checkpoint, a weathered wooden post with a metal box attached to it. Elena opened the box and found a laminated card with instructions for their first team challenge. "Team Challenge Alpha 1, she read aloud. "Using only materials found within a 50-meter radius of this checkpoint, construct a shelter capable of providing protection from sun and wind for all 3 team members. Shelter must be completed within 30 minutes and pass inspection by training staff." Santos looked around at the sparse vegetation and scattered rocks that comprised their building materials. 30 minutes to build a shelter out of nothing? Elena was already surveying the available resources, her mind cataloging possibilities and discarding options that wouldn't work within the time constraint. There were enough flat rocks to create windbreaks, sufficient dead wood to construct a basic framework, and several large Joshua trees that could provide anchor points for a roof structure. "Nguyen, start collecting flat rocks about the size of dinner plates," Elena instructed. "Santos, gather any dead wood that's straight and longer than 4 feet. I'll work on the framework design." The next 25 minutes were a lesson in efficient teamwork under pressure. Elena directed the construction, while simultaneously working on the most technically challenging aspects of the shelter. Santos proved stronger than his slender build suggested, moving rocks and wood with determined efficiency. Nguyen demonstrated problem-solving skills that came from years of making things work with limited resources. With 3 minutes remaining, they had constructed a low-profile shelter that used the natural terrain for wind protection and incorporated a roof system that would provide significant shade coverage. Elena stood back, studying their work with a critical eye, identifying weak points that might cause failure during inspection. "Looks good," Santos said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Looks like something that might collapse if anyone breathes on it too hard," Nguyen countered. Elena was making final adjustments to the anchor points when she heard the sound of boots on gravel. Staff Sergeant Chen appeared at the checkpoint, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who expected to find failure rather than success. "Team Alpha," Chen announced. "Present your shelter for inspection." Elena gestured toward their construction, standing at attention while Chen walked around the structure, testing its stability by pushing against various support points. She crawled inside to check headroom and interior space, examined the anchor points for security, and spent several minutes evaluating the overall design. "Adequate," Chen finally announced. "Proceed to checkpoint 2. As they packed their gear and prepared to continue, Santos shook his head in amazement. "I can't believe we just built a functional shelter in 30 minutes using nothing but rocks and sticks." "Wait until you see what they make us do at the next checkpoint," Elena replied, but she was pleased with how her team had performed. Both Santos and Nguyen had followed instructions efficiently, contributed ideas when appropriate, and worked hard without complaining. They were functioning as a unit, which was exactly what Hell Week was designed to test. Checkpoint 2 was located 6 miles to the southeast, following a route that would take them through a series of washes and across an exposed plateau where navigation would depend entirely on compass bearings and dead reckoning. Elena led them down from the ridge, using a deer trail that wasn't marked on their 1987 map but provided the most efficient descent route. The wash system proved more challenging than expected. What had appeared on the map as straightforward terrain turned out to be a maze of interconnected channels, some ending in impassable rock formations, others branching in directions that led away from their intended route. Elena found herself making constant micro-adjustments to their course, using her compass to maintain their general heading while adapting to the reality of the ground truth. "Are we lost?" Santos asked, after they'd spent 20 minutes working their way around a boulder field that hadn't been indicated on their map. "We're exactly where we need to be," Elena replied. "The map is a guide, not gospel. Terrain changes, maps get outdated, and sometimes the best route isn't the one that looks easiest on paper." Nguyen was studying their surroundings with the analytical eye of someone who'd learned to navigate urban environments by reading subtle cues and patterns. "How do you know where we are without being able to see any landmarks?" Elena pointed to a distant mountain peak that was barely visible through the heat haze. "That's our reference point. As long as we can maintain the correct bearing relative to that peak, we're on course. The wash system is taking us slightly north of our intended route, but it's also providing shade and easier walking. When we reach the plateau, we'll adjust our bearing to compensate." They emerged from the wash system onto the plateau exactly where Elena had predicted, having saved both time and energy by adapting to the terrain rather than fighting against it. The plateau stretched ahead of them like a moonscape, flat, exposed, and shimmering with heat waves that made distance estimation nearly impossible. "Jesus," Santos muttered, looking across the expanse of superheated rock and scattered vegetation. "How far to the next checkpoint?" Elena checked her compass and consulted the map. 3 miles due east. Should take us about an hour if we maintain pace and don't get turned around. The plateau tested them in ways that were different from the morning's climbing. The heat was becoming brutal, turning their uniforms into personal saunas and making each breath feel like inhaling from an oven. The flat terrain provided no visual reference points for navigation, forcing Elena to rely entirely on compass bearings and step counting to track their progress. Worse, the exposure was psychological as much as physical. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to rest, no relief from the sun that was climbing toward its zenith. Santos was beginning to struggle with the heat, his face flushed and his breathing becoming labored. Nguyen was managing better, but Elena could see that the monotony of the terrain was affecting his mental state. "Talk to me," Elena said as they reached the halfway point across the plateau. "Santos, tell me about your brother." Santos looked surprised by the question, but he began talking about Michael, younger by 2 years, killed in a drive-by shooting that had been intended for someone else entirely. As he talked, his breathing became more controlled, his pace steadied, and Elena could see that focusing on something other than the physical discomfort was helping him manage the challenge. "Nguyen, what made you decide to join the Marines?" Nguyen's story was more complex. A childhood spent moving between foster homes, years on the streets learning to survive, a moment of clarity that had come when he'd watched a Marine recruiter talking to kids at a community center. "He said the Marines would teach me to be part of something bigger than myself," Nguyen said. "Figured it was worth finding out if that was true." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena listened to both stories while maintaining their navigation, using the conversation to keep her teammates focused and moving while also learning things about them that might become important if the challenges escalated. Both men had experienced loss. Both had chosen military service as a way of finding purpose, and both were discovering that Hell Week was testing not just their physical capabilities, but their fundamental beliefs about who they were and what they could endure. Checkpoint 2 materialized out of the heat haze exactly where Elena's navigation had predicted, a confirmation that her dead reckoning skills were as sharp as she'd hoped. The metal box contained instructions for their second team challenge, a problem-solving exercise that required moving a 200-pound concrete block across a 50-yard obstacle course using only rope and wooden planks. Engineering problem, Elena announced after reading the instructions. We need to create a system for moving heavy weight across uneven terrain without exceeding the load limits of our materials. Santos stared at the concrete block, which sat in the middle of a course that included sand pits, raised platforms, and narrow passages between posts. How the hell are we supposed to move something that weighs more than all three of us combined? Elena was already examining the available materials: 50 feet of rope, 4 wooden planks of varying lengths, and a collection of metal stakes that could be used as anchors or pivot points. The solution required understanding leverage, weight distribution, and mechanical advantage, concepts she'd studied in theory and applied in practice during her years of mountaineering and technical rescue training. Nguyen, help me position these planks as ramps and bridges, Elena instructed. Santos, I need you to coil this rope in specific lengths for a pulley system. The next 40 minutes were a masterclass in applied physics and teamwork. Elena designed a system that used mechanical advantage to make the impossible possible, while Santos and Nguyen provided the muscle and problem-solving support to implement her plans. They moved the concrete block inch by inch across the obstacle course, adapting their techniques as they encountered each new challenge. When Master Sergeant Morrison appeared to conduct the inspection, Elena's team was exhausted but successful. The concrete block sat precisely where it was supposed to be, having been moved using only the materials provided and the principles of engineering that Elena had learned during years of technical training. Outstanding, Morrison announced, and Elena detected genuine surprise in her voice. Proceed to checkpoint 3. As they prepared to continue, Santos grabbed Elena's arm. Where did you learn to do that? Elena looked at him, then at Nguyen, both of whom were staring at her with expressions that mixed admiration with suspicion. She'd revealed more of her capabilities than she'd intended, demonstrating knowledge and skills that went well beyond what she'd listed as her background. My grandfather, she said finally, he taught me that problems always have solutions. You just have to be willing to think differently about the resources available to you. But as they left checkpoint 2 and began moving toward their third objective, Elena realized that her performance was raising questions she wasn't ready to answer. Rodriguez and his training staff were cataloging everything, looking for patterns and capabilities that would help them identify the most promising candidates. Her consistent success was making her visible in ways that might not be helpful. The problem was that she couldn't dial back her performance without compromising her team's success. Santos and Nguyen were depending on her leadership and expertise to navigate challenges that were becoming increasingly complex. And Elena was beginning to realize that Hell Week was designed not just to test individual limits, but to reveal the true character of those who could function under pressure while taking responsibility for others. Checkpoint 3 was 8 miles away, located on high ground that would require another significant climb followed by a descent into terrain that their 1987 map showed as, quote, restricted area, details unavailable. Elena led her team toward the unknown, knowing that each success was making her more visible to the training staff and wondering whether that visibility would ultimately help or hurt her chances of completing Hell Week. Behind them, she could hear the distant sounds of other teams working through the same challenges, some succeeding, some failing, all being pushed to discover exactly how much they could endure when everything familiar was stripped away and only their fundamental character remained. The sun was reaching its peak intensity, the day was only half over, and Elena was beginning to understand that Hell Week's real test wasn't physical endurance or technical skill. It was the ability to maintain your core identity while everything around you dissolved into chaos, uncertainty, and demands that seemed designed to break anyone foolish enough to attempt them. The route to Checkpoint 3 led them through terrain that seemed designed by someone with a sadistic understanding of human limitations. Elena's team descended from the plateau into a series of canyons that weren't marked on their outdated map, following game trails that appeared and disappeared without warning. navigating by compass bearing when the canyon walls blocked their view of reference points. Santos was struggling more visibly now, the accumulated effects of heat, dehydration, and physical demands beginning to compromise his performance. He was still moving, still following Elena's lead, but she could see the telltale signs of someone operating on reserves that wouldn't last much longer. His footsteps were becoming less precise, his responses to terrain changes were delayed, and his breathing was shallow and rapid despite their moderate pace. "Santos," Elena called, stopping beside a boulder that provided a few feet of shade. "Hydrate, now." "I'm fine," Santos replied automatically, but Elena could see that he was far from fine. His face was flushed, his eyes were slightly unfocused, and his hands were shaking in a way that suggested heat exhaustion was becoming heat stroke. Elena grabbed Santos by the shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. "You're not fine. You're showing early signs of heat injury, which means we need to address this now before it becomes a medical emergency." She positioned Santos in the shade, helped him remove his pack, and began implementing field treatment for heat exhaustion. Cool water on his neck and wrists, electrolyte replacement, rest in the coolest available location. Nguyen stood watch, understanding without being told that their mission had just shifted from reaching checkpoint 3 to ensuring that all team members remained capable of continuing. "This is going to set us back," Santos said weakly. "No," Elena replied firmly. "This is going to keep you functional for the rest of the exercise. Pushing through heat injury doesn't make you tough. It makes you a casualty." As Santos recovered in the shade, Elena used the opportunity to study their route to checkpoint 3. The canyon system they were following would eventually lead them to higher ground, but the approach would be technically challenging and would require careful route finding through terrain that looked increasingly complex. "How do you know all this medical stuff?" Nguyen asked quietly. Elena considered her answer while she monitored Santos's condition. The truth was that she'd spent 2 years working as a wilderness emergency medical technician, had completed advanced courses in backcountry rescue and trauma management, and had practical experience treating heat injuries, altitude sickness, and traumatic injuries in remote locations. But explaining that would raise more questions about her background and motivations. "First aid training," she said finally. "An experience with people pushing themselves beyond their limits in challenging environments." After 20 minutes, Santos had recovered enough to continue, though Elena could see that he was operating on a much smaller margin of safety than before. She adjusted their pace slightly, took more frequent breaks in available shade, and began sharing some of her own water supply to ensure Santos remained adequately hydrated. Boy. The canyon system proved more challenging than expected, requiring them to climb over boulder fields, navigate around impassable sections, and occasionally backtrack when apparent routes turned into dead ends. Elena found herself making constant micro-decisions about route selection, balancing the need to reach checkpoint 3 on schedule against the reality of Santos's diminished capabilities. "There," Nguyen said, pointing to a break in the canyon wall that might provide access to higher ground. "That looks like it could get us out of this maze." Elena studied the route Nguyen had identified. It was steep and would require technical climbing skills, but it appeared to lead in the right direction and would put them back on course for checkpoint 3. The alternative was continuing through the canyon system, which might eventually lead to their destination, but could also result in them becoming completely lost in terrain that bore no resemblance to their 1987 map. "Good eye," Elena said. "That's our route." The climb out of the canyon tested all 3 team members in different ways. Elena led, using her rock climbing experience to identify the safest and most efficient path up the steep terrain. Santos followed, drawing on reserves of determination that surprised even Elena as he forced his heat-stressed body to meet the demands of technical climbing. Nguyen brought up the rear, using his urban-developed balance and coordination to navigate terrain that was completely outside his normal experience. At the top of the climb, they found themselves on a ridgeline that provided their first clear view of the surrounding terrain in hours. Elena immediately oriented herself using distant landmarks, confirmed their position on the map, and calculated the bearing to checkpoint 3. 2 miles northeast, she announced, mostly downhill from here. But as they began their descent toward checkpoint 3, Elena noticed something that made her reconsider their tactical situation. Smoke was rising from a location that appeared to be near their destination, not the thin smoke of a campfire, but the thick, dark smoke that suggested something more significant was burning. "That's not good," Nguyen said, following Elena's gaze. Elena studied the smoke through the binoculars that were part of their equipment package. What she saw confirmed her concerns. A brush fire that appeared to be spreading rapidly through the dry vegetation surrounding Checkpoint 3. Whether it was a natural occurrence or part of Hell Week's design challenges, it represented a significant complication to their mission. "Options," Elena said, more to herself than to her teammates. Santos, who had recovered significantly during the technical climb, studied the terrain around the smoke. "We could approach from the north, stay upwind of the fire. Or we could wait here until it burns itself out," Nguyen suggested. "No point walking into a dangerous situation if we don't have to." Elena considered both alternatives while she continued to observe the fire through binoculars. The northern approach would be safer, but would add significant distance to their route and might take them through terrain that was impassable. Waiting for the fire to burn out was the conservative choice, but it would put them significantly behind schedule and might result in their missing the time window for Checkpoint 3 entirely. "Third option," Elena said finally, "we approach from the east, using that creek bed for protection and rapid retreat if conditions change. Fire moves uphill and with the wind. The creek bed runs perpendicular to both." It was a calculated risk that required Elena to make a leadership decision based on incomplete information and potentially dangerous conditions. She could see Santos and Nguyen weighing her plan, trusting her judgment, while also understanding that her decision could put them all at risk. "I'm with you," Santos said. "Let's do it," Nguyen agreed. They approached Checkpoint 3 through terrain that was increasingly affected by smoke and the possibility of fire spread. Elena led them along the creek bed she'd identified, using the depression in the ground as both concealment and protection while they moved toward their objective. The air was thick with smoke that made breathing difficult and reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. When they finally reached Checkpoint 3, they found a scene that looked like something from a disaster movie. The brush fire was burning in a rough circle around the checkpoint marker, contained by fire breaks that had clearly been prepared in advance, but creating an environment that was hot, smoky, and psychologically intimidating. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting at the checkpoint, standing calmly in the middle of the controlled burn like it was perfectly normal to conduct military training in what appeared to be the middle of an environmental catastrophe. "Team Alpha," Rodriguez announced as they approached, "you're the first team to reach Checkpoint 3. Elena felt a moment of pride at their achievement, followed immediately by wariness about what that accomplishment might mean. Being first could indicate superior performance, or it could mean they'd taken risks that other teams had been smart enough to avoid. "Your challenge at Checkpoint 3, Rodriguez continued, is to establish communication with base camp using the radio equipment provided, report your current status and position, and receive new orders for the remainder of the exercise." Elena opened the metal box and found a military radio that appeared to be standard issue but had obviously been modified in ways that weren't immediately apparent. She began setting up the communication equipment while Santos and Nguyen established a defensive perimeter, a precaution that seemed appropriate given the challenging environment they were operating in. "Base Camp, this is Team Alpha," Elena transmitted after establishing what appeared to be a clear frequency. "We are at Checkpoint 3, all team members present and mission capable." The response came through clearly. "Team Alpha, this is Base Camp. Confirm your position using grid coordinates." Elena consulted their map and provided the coordinates for Checkpoint 3, which were acknowledged by Base Camp. Then came the information that changed everything about their mission. "Team Alpha, be advised that Hell Week parameters have changed. You are now operating in a survival scenario with limited resources and no predetermined end time. Your mission is to reach Extraction Point Delta, coordinates follow, using only the equipment currently in your possession." Elena copied down the coordinates for Extraction Point Delta, calculated the distance and bearing, and realized that their navigation exercise had just become something much more serious. Extraction Point Delta was 18 miles away, located in terrain that would require them to cross 2 mountain ranges and navigate through areas that weren't covered by their map at all. Additional information, the radio continued. Other teams are also moving toward Extraction Point Delta. First team to reach the extraction point wins the evolution. Teams that fail to reach extraction within 48 hours are considered casualties and will be removed from Hell Week. Santos looked at Elena with an expression that mixed excitement with concern. This just became a competition. "This just became real," Elena replied, studying the map and calculating what 18 miles of unknown terrain would demand from a team that had already been operating under stress for 36 hours. As they prepared to leave Checkpoint 3, Elena realized that Hell Week had shifted from a series of individual challenges to something that more closely resembled actual combat operations. They were now responsible for long-range navigation, resource management, tactical decision-making, and accomplishing their mission while competing against other teams that were equally motivated to succeed. Rodriguez watched them pack their equipment and prepare to move out, his expression unreadable. "One more thing," he said as they prepared to leave. "The training staff will no longer be providing support, medical assistance, or guidance. You're on your own until you reach extraction or until you're recovered as casualties." Elena felt the weight of that information settle over their team. They were no longer trainees being guided through challenges. They were operators responsible for their own success or failure, with consequences that would determine their future in the Marine Corps and their fundamental understanding of their own capabilities. As they left Checkpoint 3 and began moving toward Extraction Point Delta, Elena could hear the distant sounds of other teams working through the same realization. Some would rise to meet this escalated challenge. Others would break under the pressure of operating without support in unfamiliar terrain with a mission that had no guaranteed outcome. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and Elena realized that they would be operating through the night, navigating by stars and compass through mountain terrain that could kill them as easily as test them. Santos and Nguyen fell in behind her as she led them away from the controlled burn and toward 18 miles of unknown country. She could feel their trust, their dependence on her leadership, and the weight of responsibility for their success or failure. Hell Week had just become something that would define who they were for the rest of their lives. The 18 miles to Extraction Point Delta would have been challenging under ideal conditions: well-rested operators, detailed maps, clear weather, and known terrain. Elena's team had none of those advantages. They were operating on minimal sleep, carrying equipment that was already showing signs of wear, navigating through mountain country that existed as blank spaces on their outdated map, and competing against other teams that were equally desperate to succeed. But as Elena led Santos and Nguyen away from Checkpoint 3, something fundamental shifted in her approach to the challenges they were facing. The artificial constraints of Hell Week training, the scheduled breaks, the medical support, the underlying safety net of knowing that everything was controlled and monitored, had been stripped away. They were now operating in conditions that closely resembled actual combat operations, where success depended entirely on their ability to function as a unit under pressure. Elena felt herself settling into a rhythm of movement and decision-making that came from years of training that she hadn't fully revealed to anyone, including Rodriguez and his staff. Her grandfather's lessons had extended far beyond hiking with a sprained ankle or learning to manage pain through mental discipline. Eduardo Vasquez had been training his granddaughter for exactly this kind of situation: extended operations in hostile terrain with limited resources and no external support. The first 5 miles took them through relatively open country that allowed for rapid movement and easy navigation. Elena maintained a pace that was fast enough to build their lead over competing teams, but sustainable enough to preserve energy for the more demanding terrain that lay ahead. Santos had recovered completely from his earlier heat exhaustion and was moving with renewed confidence. Nguyen was adapting to wilderness navigation with the same street-smart awareness that had kept him alive in urban environments. As darkness began to fall, Elena called for a brief halt to assess their situation and plan their approach to the night portion of the movement. They had covered approximately 1/3 of the distance to Extraction Point Delta, had encountered no insurmountable obstacles, and were still functioning effectively as a team. "How are we doing this?" Santos asked as they rested in the concealment of a rock formation that provided both shelter and a vantage point for observing their surroundings. "Doing what?" Elena replied, though she understood what Santos was really asking. "You're navigating through terrain we've never seen before, in conditions that should be impossible, like you've done this 100 times, Santos continued. "That's not normal first aid training and cross-country running experience." Nguyen was studying Elena with the same analytical intensity he'd probably used to assess threats and opportunities on the streets of Los Angeles. "Santos is right. You're not just keeping up with this, you're making it look easy. That's not accident or luck." Elena considered how much truth she was willing to reveal. Her teammates deserved honest answers, especially now that their success depended entirely on their ability to trust each other and function as a unit. But explaining her actual background would require admitting that she'd been less than completely honest about her motivations for attempting Hell Week. "My grandfather didn't just teach me hiking and first aid," Elena said finally. "After he came back from Vietnam, he spent 20 years working as a survival instructor for various military units. When I was growing up, he used to take me on what he called educational experiences. Multi-day expeditions in remote areas where the only rule was that we had to accomplish our objectives using only what we could carry." Santos stared at her. "You're saying you've been training for this your entire life?" "I'm saying my grandfather believed that soft times create soft people, and he wasn't going to let that happen to his granddaughter," Elena replied. "By the time I was 16, I could navigate by stars, construct shelter from natural materials, find water in desert environments, and function effectively on minimal food and sleep for extended periods." Nguyen shook his head slowly. "Jesus Christ, Vasquez. You're not a recruit trying to prove she belongs in the Marines. You're already trained to a level that most Marines never reach." Elena felt the weight of that assessment, understanding that her teammates were beginning to grasp the implications of what she'd revealed. She wasn't struggling to meet Hell Week's challenges because Hell Week was essentially a condensed version of training she'd been receiving her entire life. "Why?" Santos asked. "Why go through all that preparation for something that most people never even attempt?" Elena looked out across the darkening landscape, considering how to explain motivations that were complex and personal and tied to family history that went back 3 generations of military service. Her grandfather had served in Vietnam, her father had died in the First Gulf War, and she had grown up understanding that military service was both a family tradition and a way of honoring sacrifices that had defined her family's identity. "Because my grandfather taught me that the world is not a safe place, and people who can't handle adversity become victims of those who can," Elena said. "He wanted me to be someone who could protect others, not someone who needed protection." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices carrying across the still night air. Elena immediately shifted into tactical mode, motioning for Santos and Nguyen to remain silent while she identified the source of the noise. Through her binoculars, she could see lights moving through the terrain approximately half a mile to their north. Another team, also moving toward Extraction Point Delta, but taking a different route that would eventually converge with their path. "Competition," Santos whispered. Elena studied the movement pattern of the other team's lights, analyzing their pace, direction, and apparent level of organization. What she saw concerned her. The other team was moving in a tight formation that suggested good discipline, their lights were properly controlled to minimize visibility, and their pace was consistent with a team that understood night movement techniques. "That's Team Charlie," Elena said, recognizing the disciplined movement patterns. Cole, Martinez, and Johnson. Cole's team represented Elena's most serious competition. Cole had the physical strength and mental toughness of a successful wrestler. Martinez brought practical experience from years of construction work that translated directly to problem-solving under pressure, and Johnson had the tactical awareness and leadership experience of a former team captain. "What's the plan?" Nguyen asked. Elena considered their options. They could maintain their current route and hope to stay ahead of Team Charlie through superior navigation and pace. They could alter their route to avoid contact, which might reduce the risk of direct competition but could also lead them through more difficult terrain. Or they could attempt to observe Team Charlie's route and capabilities, gathering intelligence that might provide tactical advantages later in the movement. "We maintain our route," Elena decided, "but we increase our pace and improve our movement discipline. No lights, unless absolutely necessary for navigation, communication by hand signals only, and we assume that other teams are monitoring our movements just as we're monitoring theirs." They resumed movement through terrain that was becoming increasingly challenging as they approached the first mountain range between their current position and Extraction Point Delta. Elena led them through a series of switchbacks that gained elevation rapidly while following natural features that provided concealment from observation. Her night vision, developed through years of training in low-light conditions, allowed her to navigate efficiently without artificial illumination. Santos and Nguyen adapted to the new movement conditions with impressive flexibility. Santos used his wrestling experience to maintain balance and control on steep, uneven terrain. Nguyen applied his urban survival skills to moving quietly and efficiently through environments where sound and light discipline could mean the difference between success and failure. By midnight, they had crossed the first mountain range and were beginning their descent toward the valley that separated them from the final climb to Extraction Point Delta. Elena called for another brief halt to assess their progress and plan their approach to the remaining challenges. "We're ahead of schedule," she reported quietly. "If we maintain our current pace, we should reach Extraction Point Delta by dawn." "What about the other teams?" Santos asked. Elena had been monitoring the progress of competing teams by listening for sounds of movement and watching for lights that might indicate their positions. Based on what she could observe, Team Charlie was maintaining a parallel route that kept them close but not directly competitive. Team Bravo, Williams, Patterson, and Rodriguez appeared to be taking a longer but potentially safer route that might allow them to arrive at Extraction Point Delta in better condition but possibly later. "Charlie is still in contention," Elena said. "Bravo might be playing a longer game, trying to arrive fresh rather than first." The other team's the training officer rolled his eyes, then saw her complete Hell Week without breaking sweat. When Elena Vasquez stepped into formation at Camp Pendleton for Hell Week selection, the training officer rolled his eyes. Another young woman trying to prove a point in the Marines' most grueling special operations assessment. What he couldn't have known was that he was witnessing the arrival of someone whose preparation would redefine what excellence looked like under pressure. Elena had listed cross-country running, rock climbing, and martial arts as her qualifications, modest credentials that barely hinted at her true capabilities. Behind those simple entries lay 14 years of intensive training from her grandfather, Gunnery Sergeant Eduardo Vasquez, a Vietnam War reconnaissance specialist who had dedicated his post-military life to ensuring his granddaughter would never face the kind of inadequate preparation that had killed her father in Iraq. Elena's story began with tragedy and transformation. Her father, First Lieutenant David Vasquez, had died leading a reconnaissance patrol in 1991, ambushed while gathering intelligence on enemy positions. Her grandfather blamed himself for not preparing his son adequately, vowing that Elena would never face similar dangers unprepared. From age 8 to 22, Elena received what amounted to a complete special operations education. Every summer, every school break, most weekends were dedicated to advanced wilderness survival, tactical movement, reconnaissance techniques, technical climbing, combat first aid, long-range navigation, communications, and small unit tactics. Her grandfather treated this as a second education more important than anything she learned in school. This wasn't casual hiking or basic first aid, it was professional-level training that exceeded what most military personnel ever received. Elena learned to function independently under extreme pressure, conduct solo reconnaissance operations, and maintain perfect performance while carrying the weight of family legacy and personal responsibility. Hell Week's opening challenges revealed Elena's exceptional capabilities gradually. While other candidates struggled with basic physical demands, Elena moved through obstacles with fluid efficiency. When others collapsed from exhaustion, she maintained energy reserves that seemed inexhaustible. When leadership challenges emerged, she stepped forward with natural authority that inspired confidence in teammates and grudging respect from instructors. Her team included Santos, a former wrestler whose strength and determination masked deep insecurities about his background, and Nguyen, a street-smart recruit from Los Angeles whose urban survival skills translated surprisingly well to military challenges. Together, they formed a unit that complemented each other's strengths while covering individual weaknesses. The first major test came during Checkpoint 1, where teams faced complex problem-solving challenges that required both physical capability and tactical thinking. Elena's approach revealed training that went far beyond basic military preparation. She analyzed situations with the expertise of someone who had been educated in special operations methodology from childhood. As Hell Week intensified, Elena found herself in the difficult position of concealing her true capabilities while ensuring her team's success. She had chosen to earn her place through demonstrated performance rather than inherited credentials, but the challenges pushed her beyond the point where she could maintain that carefully controlled image. Santos struggled with heat exhaustion during a particularly demanding evolution, and Elena's response revealed medical knowledge that exceeded basic first aid training. She diagnosed his condition, implemented treatment protocols, and coordinated his recovery with precision that suggested extensive emergency medical experience. Nguyen faced navigation challenges in terrain unlike anything he had experienced. and Elena guided him through complex route-finding techniques, while teaching him skills that built his confidence and capability. Her instruction methods revealed not just knowledge, but the ability to transfer that knowledge under pressure, a hallmark of experienced military leaders. The team dynamics that emerged during these challenges demonstrated the fundamental principles that special operations units were built on: individual excellence, supporting collective success, leadership that adapted to changing circumstances, and unwavering commitment to mission accomplishment and team welfare. Hell Week's culminating challenge required teams to navigate 18 miles of unknown terrain to reach Extraction Point Delta within strict time limits. This wasn't just an endurance test. It was a comprehensive evaluation of everything participants had learned about teamwork, leadership, navigation, tactical thinking, and performance under pressure. Elena led her team through this challenge with capabilities that increasingly revealed her extraordinary preparation. She navigated through mountain country using techniques that combined electronic and natural methods, maintained perfect pace that preserved energy while building their lead over competing teams, and adapted their route based on changing conditions and tactical considerations. The 18-mile movement became a masterclass in small unit leadership. Elena assigned roles based on individual strengths, maintained team morale during difficult periods, and made tactical decisions that demonstrated understanding of special operations principles that most recruits never encountered. When they encountered competing teams, Elena's approach revealed tactical awareness that went beyond basic military training. She analyzed other teams' capabilities, adapted her own team's approach to take advantage of opportunities, and timed their movements to maximize their chances of success while minimizing risks. Extraction Point Delta wasn't just a finish line, it was a forward operating base complete with defensive positions, communication equipment, and a command post. The final challenge required teams to conduct reconnaissance, develop tactical plans, and execute complex missions under observation by evaluators assessing not just success or failure, but methods used to achieve objectives. Elena's team received a mission that would have challenged experienced special operations personnel: penetrate the facility's defensive perimeter, locate and retrieve specific intelligence materials from the command post, and extract to a designated rally point without detection. It required stealth, tactical coordination, and the ability to adapt to changing conditions in an actively defended environment. The mission unfolded with precision that surprised even Elena. She assigned specific roles based on team members' strengths, coordinated their movements with hand signals that minimized communication requirements, and led them through the facility with confidence that suggested extensive experience with similar operations. Santos provided security with perfect noise and movement discipline. Nguyen handled communications and coordination with the same street-smart awareness that had kept him alive in urban environments. Elena conducted the intelligence retrieval with technical skills that went far beyond anything she had revealed during Hell Week. They completed their mission in 22 minutes and 37 seconds without triggering any alarms or detection systems, a performance that exceeded what most trained special operations units achieved in similar scenarios. Elena's exceptional performance demanded explanation. Training Officer Rodriguez, who had initially dismissed her as another recruit trying to prove a point, now recognized that his assessment had been completely wrong. During a private conversation after the mission, Elena revealed the truth about her background and preparation. Her grandfather hadn't just provided casual outdoor education, he had delivered professional-level special operations training that included everything from advanced tactical techniques to classified operational procedures. Elena had been raised from childhood to be a special operations soldier, receiving training that exceeded what most military personnel ever experienced. The revelation explained not just her consistent performance, but her approach to challenges, her leadership style, and her ability to remain calm under pressure that would break most people. She had concealed this background because she wanted to earn her place based on demonstrated capability rather than inherited credentials or family connections. Rodriguez faced a complex professional decision. Elena had technically violated requirements for complete honesty during the selection process, but she had also demonstrated exactly the kind of capabilities and character that special operations units were designed to identify and develop. Rather than immediate judgment, Rodriguez designed one final challenge, a solo mission that would test everything Elena had learned, not just from her grandfather but from Hell Week itself. No teammates, no support, no safety net. Just Elena, basic equipment, and a mission that would determine her military future. The solo mission required her to infiltrate a simulated enemy facility, conduct detailed reconnaissance, retrieve classified intelligence materials, and extract without detection by experienced military personnel actively patrolling the area. Success would confirm her readiness for the most elite military assignments. Failure would end her career before it began. Elena approached this challenge with tactical sophistication that demonstrated the full extent of her preparation. She spent hours conducting reconnaissance, analyzing defensive positions, studying patrol patterns, and developing an approach that maximized her chances of success while minimizing exposure to detection. The infiltration phase unfolded with precision that revealed years of specialized training. Elena bypassed electronic surveillance systems, avoided patrol contacts, and reached the interior of the facility without triggering any alarms. The intelligence retrieval required technical skills that went beyond anything demonstrated during Hell Week. But Elena completed the mission efficiently and extracted successfully. When she reached the designated rally point 90 minutes before dawn, Rodriguez was waiting with an expression that mixed professional assessment with genuine admiration. Her performance had exceeded what experienced special operations personnel typically achieved in similar scenarios. Elena's Hell Week performance opened doors to opportunities that went beyond standard Marine Corps assignments. Rodriguez offered her 3 options: standard assignment to force reconnaissance with accelerated promotion, immediate transfer to a classified program involving specialized operations, or temporary assignment to a joint service program developing new special operations approaches. Elena chose the classified program, understanding that it represented the best opportunity to honor her family's legacy while serving in roles that would test everything she had learned. Her teammates Santos and Nguyen also achieved their goals. Santos selected for force reconnaissance, Nguyen assigned to specialized urban operations, validating the team dynamics that had carried them through Hell Week's challenges. The story follows Elena, Santos, and Nguyen through 30 years of distinguished military careers that all traced back to their Hell Week experience. Elena disappeared into classified assignments that pushed the boundaries of what individual operators could accomplish, eventually retiring as a colonel after a career that honored her grandfather's training and her father's sacrifice. Santos rose through the ranks to become a general, providing strategic leadership that drew on his Hell Week experience with Elena as foundational to everything he accomplished. Nguyen completed 20 years of military service before transitioning to civilian practice as a lawyer, helping veterans navigate challenges that civilian society often didn't understand. All 3 maintained contact throughout their careers, understanding that their shared experience during Hell Week had created bonds that transcended normal military relationships. Elena's performance became part of the oral tradition passed down through generations of special operations personnel, serving as inspiration for those facing their own impossible challenges. Elena's story revealed that excellence in military service wasn't about meeting minimum standards or surviving challenges. It was about consistently performing at levels that inspired others and accomplished missions that mattered. Her Hell Week performance demonstrated that the most demanding challenges revealed not weakness or limitations, but strength and capabilities that people didn't know they possessed. The training officer who had initially rolled his eyes learned that his assumptions about gender, background, and capability were fundamentally flawed. Elena hadn't just proven that women could succeed in special operations. She had redefined what excellence looked like under pressure and demonstrated that proper preparation combined with unwavering character could produce results that exceeded everyone's expectations. Her grandfather's training had prepared her not just for physical and technical challenges, but for the fundamental character tests that determined who could be trusted with the most demanding responsibilities military service required. Elena completed Hell Week without breaking under pressure, but more importantly, she completed it without compromising the values and principles that had guided her throughout her life. Hell Week Chronicles tells the story of what becomes possible when exceptional preparation meets unwavering character under the most demanding circumstances. Elena's journey from underestimated recruit to elite operator demonstrates that excellence isn't about natural talent or favorable circumstances. It's about the intersection of thorough preparation, fundamental character, and the commitment to serve something larger than oneself. The story challenges assumptions about capability, reveals the importance of proper preparation, and demonstrates that the most important victories are won not through individual achievement, but through the commitment to help others succeed and serve causes that matter more than personal ambition. Elena's Hell Week performance became legendary not because it was impossible, but because it showed what was possible when someone was properly prepared, appropriately challenged, and given the opportunity to discover their true potential. Her story continues to inspire special operations personnel who face their own seemingly impossible challenges and need examples of what can be accomplished through preparation, determination, and the refusal to quit when the stakes are highest. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.